Our God is on his throne ruling the affairs of men. God does not change. His truths have not changed. He's promised a witness in the church according to the election of grace in all ages that will stand for the old paths, defending his truth. The Primitive Baptist Digital Library is pleased to present the Word of Sovereign Grace. Timely video messages based on the King James Bible and the doctrines taught by Christ and the apostles.
And Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the third generation. The children also of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were brought up upon Joseph's knees. Brother Helms has been talking to us about those things that we should stand against. And the correct course in life to take rather than to tolerate those things. Yesterday I mentioned about the difference that individuals feel when they have their own grandchildren, the difference that they feel then than they did when they were watching other people, what they considered acting foolish over their own grandchildren. I noticed the look on many of your faces and a smile that you knew exactly what I was talking about. But I think that there's probably no greater pattern of the love of the family, a love of the old folks, a love of the young folks, than is found here in the message concerning Jacob and his family. And if you'll notice that Joseph was 110 years old at the time, and then it made the statement that he saw these children of the third generation, and that they were brought up upon Joseph's knee, meant that there was some responsibility, not just to the next generation, but for other generations. And that there was a closeness, a close-knit feeling between and among this family. I don't think we have to go very far to understand this kind of love. And because if you remember how that Jacob loved Joseph, you remember the recorded the things, the events that transpired in the book of Genesis concerning the jealousy of the other brethren, the sons of Leah, toward Joseph, and what transpired. The Bible tells us that Joseph was about 17 years of age. It meant that he was, and the Bible indicates that God, the Spirit of God was with him, and that he found, he had evidently great wisdom. And Jacob certainly recognized this and showed some favoritism toward him, in that he wove him, got him a coat of many colors. And it is after that Joseph was sold to the Ishmaelites, and they brought him into the land of Egypt, there was things that Joseph did not forget. And as Brother Newell has brought this morning, those things that are important, I think it's our remembrance of things is very important. Joseph didn't forget his father. He didn't forget his brethren that were left behind. And his father didn't forget him. There was a sorrow in his heart that shows the tenderness of that love between that son and that father. Now, I know a lot of people will say, and some tragedy occurs in life, people oftentimes in trying to comfort and trying to grope for words will say, time will heal and you'll get over it. But you don't get over it. You may get more used or accustomed to not being around loved ones, but that love is still there. And so this father loved this boy, and this boy loved this father. Do you remember as it transgressed and the events began to unfurl, and I'll not go into all of the dreams, the interpretation of those dreams. Joseph's rise in the favor of those in the land of Egypt. There was a time when he was about 30 years old, and he found favor, and he was well blessed, and he was put over this great thing to set up in the storehouses of Egypt to take care of for the years of famine that was coming, that he knew was coming. And sure enough, eventually, that it hit the land of Canaan to the extent that they were without corn for their little ones and for their animals. And so Jacob sent the boys, all except Benjamin. He sent their other boys into the land of Egypt with the wherewithal to buy the grain to sustain them in the time of famine. And they came in, and Joseph recognized them. They didn't recognize Joseph. And he didn't reveal himself to them. And you might say, well, he engaged in some strange things. But I believe that if we began to see unfolding there the great love that God had placed in the hearts of these individuals, the closeness of the family. We hear a lot today about the family. And I think that there is probably no more important issue that we face in our own lives than the breakdown of the family unit, the disintegration of the family unit. Where that today in this land of ours, oftentimes parents would turn their back upon very small children, decide they want to live their own life, or what they consider their own life, not realizing that when God graces parents with little children, that is part of their life. They may be able to separate them from them, but they'll never be able from in their own mind for a short period of time, but they're still bone of their bone and flesh of their flesh. And it seems to be the trend in this life and in this country and some places of the world, that when people seemingly grow old and tired in life, that they're not worth anything anymore. But I want you to notice, here was a 17-year-old boy, and he lived to be 110. And when he was 110, he wasn't worthless. He had the children of the third generation upon his knees to show the importance of pulling together of that family from the very small, from those still small enough to sit upon their grandfather and great-grandfather's knee until the old man. Now, if you'll notice the inquiry of Joseph, one of the first things he inquired of, and this is the message that they gave unto Jacob when they returned. When Jacob was questioning them, why in the world did they tell him, did they tell this ruler, who they didn't know who he was, that they had a younger brother back with his father? Why in the world, he said, did you do me this way? Did you tell them? And they said, the man asked us straightly of our state and of our kindred, saying, is your father yet alive? Can you not see the love? Here all those years have have passed. Here's someone who has risen to great authority. In fact, the whole known world at that time depended on them to be sustained in the time of famine. What is the thing that he asked about? Is your father yet alive? Oh, it didn't mean he was interested in that old man. He hadn't become old enough that he decided that old man was useless. That old man was important to that boy over there in the land of Egypt. Is your father yet alive? Have you another brother? He knew he had another brother, but he wanted to find out something about him, all right. And he said, we told him according to the tenor of these words, could we certainly know that he would say, bring your brother down. And you know, finally, when the provisions ran out, Jacob first said, you know, you're not going to take him down. I'm just not going to let you. And then the provisions ran out. And you know, people began to think a little bit different at that time. Sometimes we forget for just a few moments of time that the Lord, who has been gracious to us, is still with us, don't we? We forget that He's still blessing. And they brought him down, and it said in the 43rd chapter, book of Genesis, and said, and when Joseph saw Benjamin with them, he said to the ruler of his house, bring these men home, and slay, and make ready, for these men shall dine with me at noon. What a delight! What a delightful thought. Scared them pretty bad. They didn't know what was going on. They thought he was going to come, bring them up there, and ask them about the money that was in the sack when they got home. They didn't know what in the world had happened with that. They talked to one of the keepers of the house and told him not to worry about that. And he was the one that took care of that. But they came on down, and you know the Egyptians would not eat with the Israelites. And so they set themselves apart separately, and they brought Joseph presents. And when they came in, he asked them of their welfare and said, is your father well? Not only does he want to know now, is he alive, now he wants to know if he's well. I'll tell you right now, it just begins to pull things together. Now here they've grown apart for all of these years. Here are 13 plus years that they've been apart, and here they are being drawn together. And he said, is your father well? The old man of whom you spake, is he yet alive? Does it sound to you like he wanted to see that old brother? Does it sound to you like he wanted to see his father? Did he forget about him? He said, I'm rich and powerful now, and I don't need these folks, you know. No use for me to worry about them. Let them make it the best they can. They sold me off to the Ishmaelites. They would have killed me if it hadn't been for Reuben, probably. They sold me off. Just let them do the best they can. There's no use for me to be worried about them. They didn't worry about me. Well, that's not the way the Lord has instructed us. That's not the tenderness of heart. That's not the love that the Lord has spoken of. But you know, there came a time, Joseph saw his brother Benjamin, his mother's son, and said, is this your younger brother, of whom you spake unto me? And he said, God be gracious unto thee, my son. And Joseph made haste, for his bowels did yearn upon his brother, and he sought where to weep, and entered into his chamber, and wept there. You think he cared? I believe he cared like each of you and each of us should care about those within our own family. And we can talk about our natural family, and we could even go on and talk about our spiritual family, because we have mothers and fathers in Israel here in the world. And the church is a family. That's what it's all about. We got to care about one another, care about one another's welfare. This was what was showing up into this little close-knit family because of the love that they had in their hearts for each other, that they cared about one another, and it was the godly and the righteous thing. So he went off and wept. And then he said, and he washed his face and went out and refrained himself and said, set on bread. And they began to feed them. And then he took and sent messes unto them from before him, but Benjamin's mess was 5 times as much as any of theirs. and they drank and were merry with him. He sent Benjamin more. This was his full brother. He sent Benjamin more than he did the rest. That's mercy, isn't it? That shows love, doesn't it? Sometimes people begin to question as to how God deals with his people. But the Lord said, I will have mercy upon whom I will have mercy, and I will have compassion upon whom I will have compassion. Sometimes we begin to ask, well, what in the world is this one received and the other did not receive? The Bible is very clear that in the land of the day, when the Lord sent Elijah to the widow's house, that there were many widows in the land. But I tell you right now, that widow that the Lord sent that old prophet to was blessed, because the Lord sent the prophet to that widow's house. We don't question the Lord as toward his mercy and of his love. And you know, and I don't have time, of course, to go into all, and I will not try to do that. But you remember how that they put the cup in Benjamin's sack, and they returned there, and they were all scared to death. And when Joseph said, you're going to leave this boy with me, Judah couldn't constrain himself any longer. He said, can I speak unto the Lord's ear? He began to tell him of the old man. He said, if I don't carry him back, the old man will die. He said, I'm surety for him. There was another boy, you know, and he didn't go into too much detail about what had happened to him. But he said that he loves this boy, and we don't take him back. Now, the old man, he said he'll die. He'll die. He loves him so much. And Joseph, it said, could not refrain himself before all of them, and stood by them, and he cried. Cause every man to go out from me. And there stood no man with him, while Joseph made himself known unto his brethren. Now he was happy. He was rejoicing. They were scared to death. They didn't know what was going to transpire. Somehow or another they didn't understand. Just as they didn't understand years before, when in the jealousy of their own mind they did the terrible thing and sold their brother and caused this grief to come upon their father. They didn't understand the care and love that they were to show for those of their family. See the trouble that it caused them, and it still causes in the lives of individuals today. It's causing trouble in our country and in our world today. Many of the sections of our country, there's no father figure in the home. There's no role model there, even in the neighborhood, and the ones they have are selling drugs out of fancy cars on the street corners. What can we expect to transpire in our country as a result of that? But as Brother Helms has already said, the church has obligation to show the way. People who love the Lord and have shown their love for Him, and God recognize that God died for them on the tree of the cross, have an obligation to be an example. And every mother and father, every grandmother and grandfather here, every child in school has an obligation before God to be an example of the love of God and the love of family and the patriotism to our country, to let people know that we appreciate the freedoms that we have, to be able to sit down here at Old Parkview Church. Many of us have been coming here for a great number of years. I've been coming over 30 years myself. I still have the privilege in the state of North Carolina to sit down and worship our God together according to the dictates and the feeling and the impressions of our own heart and soul. We need to be examples of those things out in the community, because there's going to be others who are going to observe it. Elder Sammy Bryan, in preaching last weekend, told us of some of those examples, and he began to tell us what family values were not. And he said family values are not carried on with two homosexuals living together and adopting children. And he said family values are not carried on when people show a lack of care for an unborn child, that they have an abortion. And he began to go over, but when he came down, he mentioned the fact that he was the youngest of 15 children and the hardships they had. But he said, I never saw my father come home drunk. I never heard my mother say a curse word. And said, I never did see them hitting at each other like they wanted to strike one another. I tell you, talk about examples to the kids and examples of love. In the times of hardships in life, for husband and wife just to draw close together, depending upon the Lord, knowing that they face the obstacles of life, they face troubles, they face sickness, they face financial hardships, they face all of those things, but there's never a time to tear the family apart. Love needs to be shown. And so Joseph couldn't constrain himself anymore. Instead, he wept aloud. And the Egyptians in the house of Pharaoh heard. You know what? They thought that was something strange. I'm sure. Here's a ruler. Has charge of all the land of Egypt. Whatever he says goes. And here he is in there just crying out loud. And you can hear him through the walls. Well, I tell you right now, you talk about when there is love, as Joseph had love for those brethren, it's something to weep about, because only God gives you that kind of blessing and that kind of love. And Joseph said unto his brother, I am Joseph. And then he asked him again, does my father yet live? I guess he must have thought they lied to it for a moment. Now that you know I'm your brother, does my father yet live? And his brethren could not answer him, for they were troubled at his presence. And Joseph said unto his brethren, come near to me, I pray you. And they came near, and he said, I am Joseph your brother, which you sold into Egypt. Now therefore be not grieved, nor angry with yourselves, that you sold me hither, for God did send me before you to preserve life. I tell you, talk about absolving somebody of all of the evil that they intended to do to him, to say, the Lord sent me ahead of you. The Lord loved us enough. The Lord loved this family. The mercy of God upon this family, that he sent me before you to preserve life. And then he began to tell them, and he took them, and he told them that God had made him Lord over all the house of Egypt. And he fell upon his brother's Benjamin's neck and wept. And Benjamin wept upon his neck. Moreover, he kissed all his brethren and wept upon them. And they say, strong men don't cry. They say there's not a time for the shedding of tears, the showing of affection within a family. It's a sad thing. Oftentimes, as I have conversed with young men and women, one of them in particular, married into the family, said she never remembered sitting on her father's knee. She never remembered him telling her that he loved her. He showed in some manner a care. That troubled her in life, caused her, I think, at a later time to fall and to ruin her own life as a result of the lack of care. I want to tell you, fathers, you need to tell the children. You need to tell the grandchildren how much you love them, and you need to show it. And I'll tell you right now, don't ever let them hear you say a word of profanity. Don't ever let them see you do those things that you don't want them to do. You don't need to be doing them. Don't need to not only not let them see, you just don't need to be doing it, because if you're going to be doing them, it's just like a person sometimes. I have a lot of people that won't say profanity in front of me because they know I'm a minister unless they forget. And then I know they do it all the time, and they just happen to slip up and do it. So the best way not to slip up is just not to do it. Amen. Grandchildren don't need to see a can of beer in grandfather's refrigerator. You know, and there's just so many things that in the tenderness A family is a place of tenderness and of love and of kindness and tender-heartedness. That's what a family is about. That's what the church family is about. A place of love and kindness and tender-heartedness. Not a place where we're going to try to get even. Now, what kind of life would it have been if Joseph said, well, now's my time to get even. I'll just get even with these boys. But he didn't do that. He wept with them, and he sent them back home to get his dad. He told Pharaoh of all of the things that had befallen him. He told him of his brother. Pharaoh says, you bring him. Gave him the best of the land, the best that there was, so that you remembered how they grew and prospered at all of those times. But you remember that this was a sad thing. It's sad with Jacob. But Joseph sent provisions. Pharaoh had given instructions, and they sent the wagons to bring the old folks and the little ones. They sent provisions for them to have on the way. And the boys went back over there, and this was such good news. Now, Joseph had been alive all this time, but they didn't know about it, so they couldn't rejoice in it. Just like a lot of people in the world today don't understand that their Savior is indeed alive and at the right hand of God, and what he's accomplished, he did it. He died upon the tree of the cross. He's at the right hand of God making intercession for you, whether you knew it or not. But when you hear about it, it causes a joy. You need to know about it. That's when rejoicing comes. That's what the preaching of the gospel is. It doesn't make it happen. The Lord himself brought it to pass, but the preaching of the gospel gives us the news so that we can rejoice in it. We can weep. It doesn't hurt to shed some tears. I stepped in the pulpit this morning with Brother Hoover. Asked me, and I turned over there and I thought, I want to know how old Joseph was when he was sold. And I found it over there. They said he was about 17. That's how old I was when I got married. So I know just exactly the period of life that it was. And as I would read of this love and of the grace of God and of the Spirit of God upon him, I had to cry. It's a beautiful story of a family. And then they sent the wagons, and they told Jacob, and his spirit failed him. He was old. And they said, behold the wagons. And he looked out, and this old brother who wouldn't believe that Joseph was alive, when he saw these evidences of the kindness of someone who had no reason to show him kindness, unless he had a great love, he knew it had to be Joseph. He said, it's enough. Went to the land of Egypt. Pharaoh wanted to know how old he was. He told him how old he was. He said, I haven't reached the years of the pilgrimage of my fathers. Which means that this old world is not our home. He had left the land of Egypt going down into the land of Canaan. But he recognized that he is still just a pilgrim. All of us who recognize that there's a better land on the other side after a while, remember that we're just pilgrims here. There's a better land. But you know, and then it says, as Joseph saw Ephraim's children, the third generation, they were brought up upon Joseph's knee. That's a wonderful thing to be able to take. In fact, I was been a little bit disturbed this weekend because all of our grandchildren are right there at home. One or two of them you don't get to see but about every 2 or 3 weeks. And she's glad to be up here with you, but she misses her grandchildren. And that's the reason just as soon as church is over, we're going to leave pretty quick. Try to get back home to see her, because there's nothing like having a child on your knee, especially having a little grandchild. I tell you, talk about feeling worthwhile. And I guess the message that I'd like to give is a lot of people down home, I don't guess it's that way up here, but they get about 80 years old and they say, well, I'm about wore out. or have some affliction of the body or something, they say, well, I'm just no account anymore. Don't ever be guilty of that. The Lord died for you upon the tree of the cross. You're worth something. Amen. Saw a poster one time of a little boy. His tousled shirt slingshot in his pocket. His hair was tousled. He said, I'm okay because God don't make no junk. And I tell you what, when we grow old in life, God still don't make any junk. We may have to go on a crutch. We may have to go in a wheelchair. God, because of that great love. And that old sister yesterday afternoon, Sister Southern, was sat at her house and she began to talk years ago when the brethren would come and tie their horses in their father's yard and then provide the things for them. Those are the things, the fellowship of the Lord's people, the showing of that love toward the Lord and to our family are the things that bind us together and gives us those treasures as we grow old in life. I tell somebody oftentimes, I begin to talk about getting up about 80 years old, and I remind them that that's how old Moses was when the Lord sent him down there to deal with Pharaoh. Moses didn't consider his life about over, did he? No, as long as the Lord blesses us to live, there's some good. And if it's nothing more than have that privilege. In the last year of my dad's life, in fact, the morning that he died, we found him dead in the road between my house and his. He had driven down. Helen and I were working on a pasture fence. We saw him drive up in the yard. I asked later our little girl, who was 4 years old, I said, what did Granddaddy do? She said he took me on his knee. He took me on his knee and he held me in his arms. I've thought about that oftentimes, brethren. There doesn't come a point in time that we're to forget the children. We're to forget the grandchildren. And there certainly doesn't come the point in time that we're to forget the old folks when they get old. Discard them away. We need to care for them. That's what's made this country of ours. We were blessed. I know that sometimes there is the kind of afflictions. There is the kind of afflictions that you can't lift. You can't do a lot of things. And sometimes the old folks have to be put in the nursing home. But Helen and I were blessed. We didn't have to put either one of our parents in the nursing home. When my dad passed away, my mother was not able to go to the funeral. She just got home from the hospital. Her mind was not as it should have been. I overheard someone mention, well, we'll have to put her in the nursing home. And I went straight through the roof. I said, not as long as me and Helen are able. For the next few weeks, we nursed her back. Get up with her at night just like a baby. When she got to feeling better, she said, I love y'all dearly, but you're rearing your children. And I'd like to get me a little mobile home. If you'll allow me to put it in the yard. And we said, well, of course, Mom. Somebody said, you know, said she's old and she's sick, said it seems foolish to spend that much money on a mobile home for just a little while. I said, listen, if she has a month of blessings where she can feel independent, feel the blessings of the Lord, and feel the peace and calm, I want her to have it. We bought it for her. And you know the kind of love that she showed? She'd grow old and we'd know when she'd grow a little more infirm, because every night in our business that we'd come up and drive up in the yard, she'd roll that window out of that little trailer and she'd stick her head out the window and she'd say, Guy, are you all right? I say, yes, Mama. It might be midnight. It might be 1 o'clock. You talk about a love of a mother. And then the Lord said in the book of Isaiah that that's what we have in the church. He said it's as we are down upon mother's knee. What a wonderful and delightful thing. That's the reason people need to join the church and to be a part of the church and go to church and not get off and be neglectful and go once in a while and miss so many of their services, is because it's like being down upon mother's knee. And then if you ever came in and Mama roll out that window. We took the key and went in. We knew that she was going into a coma or something and we'd have to take her to the hospital. Love. The love of that family. Even in old age, to take our grandchildren up on our knee. For Jacob, and you remember that, the tenderness of that, what I believe shows forth the goodness of the Master and our Savior. When Joseph brought his two sons up before Jacob. And Jacob crossed his arms and laid his right hand upon the younger and his left hand upon the older. Joseph was displeased. He thought his father was his eyes were so dim. But the old man said, I know what I'm doing. And so it is when Christ came into the world. His love for us was so much that he died upon the cross, that his grace and mercy might reach me and you. The only way in the world that I'm reached by his mercy is because that Christ died upon the cross. If the Lord's loved us with an everlasting love and blessed us with family here in the world, let's show the responsibility to that family as we ought, both the very young and the very old. And God will bless us. I thought of that. You say, well, how in the world did you bless Joseph so much? Well, I'll tell you right now. They remembered when they left the land of Egypt what Joseph said. He said, don't you leave my bones over here. Take them over here. Recognizing that there is a way after a while where we never grow old. Where there won't be any terrible things like abortion, abuse of children, abuse of parents, hatred shown in the world. Where there will be all peace, joy, and happiness. What a wonderful thing to think that we're a family. And after a while, all the family's going to be in heaven. May the Lord bless you. Amen.
Before the throne of God above, I have a strong, a perfect plea, a great high priest whose name is love, whoever lives and pleads for me.
Visit the Primitive Baptist Digital Library for videos, articles, history, hymns, and encouragement. www.primitivebaptist.net